Greetings, you're listening to Cantus Firmus at the Movies, where we are discussing the 2010 film Inception. My guest is Adam Graham. Adam is behind the website NoKingButChrist.org, as well as the YouTube page No King But Christ. No King But Christ is an organization with the mission of better uniting the Christian worldview with libertarian principles. And so, Adam, before we start discussing the film you've chosen, can you tell us a little bit about No King But Christ and why you started it?
Yeah, sure, Cody. Thanks for having me. I've been looking into apologetics and, digging deeper into theology for, more than a decade now, and kind of the political realm for, close to that. And I did a lot of research, a lot of learning, but it occurred to me a couple years ago that really a lot of that just doesn't serve much of a purpose unless I'm sharing that, teaching, doing something to actually, spread that knowledge as opposed to just consume it. So, about a year ago, or going on a year and a half or two ago, I started blogging and sharing just, things I was learning. And I didn't really want to choose between politics or religion, even though I don't, I try to keep them within their proper spheres. So I figured I'd pick a name like No King But Christ and try to integrate them both. So that's kind of what we do there. We focus on apologetics and political philosophy, kind of at that high level, and war and peace. Definitely, the controversial, the dinner topics, right? All those things safe to talk about with relatives and sensitive company. But it's kind of where we investigate that sort of thing. And it's right up our alley, I think.
Yeah, and where does the title No King But Christ come from?
Well, it's kind of I was really trying to rack my brain thinking of what in the world to call it, because, a lot of good titles are taken, and it was kind of a thing that at least we were saying at the time. It kind of was a saying in Christian and libertarian circles that, I traffic in. I think it has some history in Revolutionary War period, or even like a bit further back than that in church history. But generally the idea is ultimately, Christ is King of Kings, and when we're talking about libertarianism, we're talking about rulers, we're talking about authority, we're talking about kingship. So it's kind of emphasizing that, working at a couple different levels, maybe emphasizing that kingship of Christ above all, and in just about everything. So especially politics at a pretty big level too. So a little bit of that.
What I think I'd like to do real quick is talk about, just kind of give a brief overview of the movie that you'd picked, and then I'd like to ask you why it was that you picked it, what made it interesting to you. So the movie, as I mentioned, is 2010's Inception. It's directed by Christopher Nolan. It's got a pretty good cast, actually. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Dom Cobb, which is not a very easy name to say. It's kind of unpleasant. It almost feels like I'm speaking Klingon when I say it.
Yeah.
Dom Cobb is a professional thief who learns the secrets of his marks by infiltrating their dreams. His partner, Arthur, is played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Ariadne, which is a name from Greek mythology, is an architecture student who creates the dream mazes that they use, and that's Ellen Page plays Ariadne. Ierns is somebody who impersonates people inside the dream world, so he's part of the crew. He's played by Tom Hardy. And Ken Watanabe plays Mr. Saito, who's a businessman, a Japanese businessman who employs Cobb for a mission. Then there's, of course, Mal, who plays Cobb's deceased wife, who shows up in a lot of the dreamscapes. She's played by Marion Cotillard. Cotillard?
Cotillard. Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. It would have to be with her accent.
Oh,
and then, of course, Cillian Murphy plays Robert Fisher, who is the Mark, the guy they're going after, whose dreams they're trying to infiltrate. So the real basic plot is that Cobb and his crew are hired by this Japanese businessman to implant an idea into the mind of his competitor. And the idea is that he should split up his massive corporation into smaller companies. And the job becomes increasingly difficult as the memory of Cobb's dead wife comes from his subconscious, and it sort of obstructs their mission and seeks to bring Cobb back into the dream world permanently. And there's a lot of... They get into it, and of course we'll have spoilers. We're not going to assume that someone hasn't seen the film. But there's obviously a lot of guilt that he has about his wife's death, which he blames himself for. So Adam, why did you pick this movie to discuss when I got a hold of you? Because I kind of almost expected you to pick a film that would relate somehow to political philosophy or something like that. So what was it about this that stuck out for you?
Well, yeah, when you reached out and asked me kind of, what films I might be interested in, normally if I was thinking about my favorite films, it might I mentioned to you The Fountain, and there were definitely a handful of other films that I would maybe enjoy discussing, but I really tried to think of something that a film that had made an impression on me that I felt like had a lot of different levels, a lot of different points of discussion, points of relation that you could get into, especially in philosophy and theology. So I guess I kind of weighted a little bit more toward that. I mean, bear in mind, we certainly deal with political topics on No King but Christ, but ultimately, I like to weight theology and that end a little bit heavier in the media realm. No one likes blatantly political films. We like good stories. Inception, from when I saw it originally to now, has really stuck around as just a good story, and certainly one that's rife with a lot of different intellectual levels that it can be addressed with. I remember, it's not every film, it's not the regular Marvel film that you might think about it a little bit on the way home. You'll think about it whether you enjoyed it or not, or a cool scene or a interesting idea they had. But films like Inception and a lot of the other films that I could say may have made an impression on me over the years, they're ones that you really think about. Like and believe me, if you go and Google Inception plot holes or synopsis or discussion or anything, you will find thread upon thread, because it's just that deep and that involved and just really good writing and really good stories. So I think definitely that was a little bit of my mindset, trying to find something that really was just rich with things that we might be able to talk about. And it does definitely tie into, at least in my mind, some of the things that I had seen, themes and ideas in there, definitely on a theological level, not just a philosophical level. So I'm sure we'll get into that. But yeah, I had to choose something, and this seemed like a pretty good one. So,
well, there's also a lot of it seems to me that there's a lot here related to human psychology. That as I thought about it and where I wanted to go with it, I thought, well, I'm moving. Some of the places I wanted to go are moving slightly out of philosophy, but still, relevant to these issues of the human condition and meaning and what it means to live a good life and what it means to be human. Because we can talk about the philosophy aspects of it and all that stuff, but to me, as I watch it, what's interesting about Nolan is that everything he does feels very organic, I guess, and he's not afraid of using some of these sort of special effects and some of the crazy things you see where these dreamscapes are being folded and molded, and but at the same time, there's a certain groundedness and almost a grittiness to it, I guess. I know that he has made a big point of sticking with film instead of moving into digital territory, and has even pleaded with other filmmakers to continue using 35 and 70 millimeter to shoot films. And as I watched it, it made me think of there's a German miniseries that was made by Rainer Werner Fassbinder called World on a Wire that ended up being kind of ripped off by The Matrix and some other things later. But one of the things that stuck out to me as I watched World on a Wire is that it's all this sort of high-tech stuff with, living in this virtual world and stuff like that, but very little of it feels like you're in. It doesn't feel like Tron or anything like that. Most of it feels like just the real world, even in the dreamscape. And there are places in this where the dreamscape is, definitely, stands out from reality and doesn't fit in. But there's also a lot of it that just does feel very organic and real. They don't go out of their way to make it seem, especially like the technology they use to connect people and go into the dreams. They don't have like these kind of crazy apparatus or anything like that. It's just knock the guy out and hook him up to this,
It's kind of machine. You think of contrasting it with, a lot of people think, oh, it's in a dream, so it has to be crazy colors or completely, full of impossible sorts of imagery, things that could never exist outside of the dream. And certainly when you later on in the film see the sorts of things that Dom and his wife at the time had created, they certainly do, pertain to things that couldn't exist in the real world. But you're completely right. Part of course, the reason for them constructing those dreams is to put their subjects, their kind of co-dreamers, in a situation where it feels familiar to them, and yet sometimes they don't even know they're in a dream, or that it's supposed to feel so real that they can't quite separate it. And of course, in that sense, there wouldn't be any reason to put these fantastical supernatural things, in the dream. And so you get very little of that, a little bit with Ariadne's kind of, crazy sandbox creativity. I mean, they even make a point of it, right? If you differ too far from what the dreamer is expecting, their subconscious will attack it and understand that it's kind of being tampered with, right? Because of course, in our dream, if we're thinking about our own dreams, they are fantastical, but I don't know. I don't dream of anything that looks like an LSD trip or, a crazy, rave sort of imagery or real impossible things, right? It's usually pretty grounded. It's something from experience. It feels pretty real, but then there's an element of it that's not quite real, but I can't even put my finger on what's not real about it, right? So you're right. As you're watching the film, I feel like you understand that things aren't really real there, but the fact that it's played as though it's part of a dream, even the things that are CGI, I don't come away thinking about the film right now thinking, man, it was full of CGI. Even though I know it was, effects and computer generated things, I don't think of it, reflecting on it as a film that's full of effects. I think of it as just a really rooted, film. Maybe you compare again, the original Star Wars versus the later prequels, where it's pretty obvious, which one is gritty and relatable and which one is kind of polished and stylized, and you can tell the difference,
Or even a film like The Matrix, where the two different worlds feel very different. Whereas in this, you don't get that so much. But so as I'm watching the movie, one thing that seems to come up, I think it's in the beginning and in the end, this notion of ideas being like a virus or like a cancer. Mm-hmm. And so the title comes from this notion of placing an idea in someone's mind that you make them think is their own. So that's what Inception is in this film. And one thing that's kind of weird to me is there's this discussion of whether that's possible, and it seems to me that it happens all the time because in real life, like, our ideas are very rarely our own. They talk about Inception as this thing that, like, is it even possible to do it? But I mean, most of the things that we believe, or even the way that we create new beliefs or ideas or come to new ideas, are just using these building blocks that we've been given by other people. Our culture, our parents, our teachers, or whatever, they shape the way we see the world. They shape our values, what we assume is good. And it seems like if people can give us ideas in this world, and we know that they're giving us ideas, and we're still, imbibing them as if they're our own, wouldn't that be even more possible to do so in a dream? I remember reading that Ayn Rand had once said that nearly all of her ideas were her own, that they were original. And if someone like Ayn Rand can be so deceived in her waking life, why couldn't someone think that in a dream, where you just assume that everyone you see is a projection of your own mind?
Yeah, I think maybe the difference they were trying to get across there is that, we have a lot of beliefs that we take on and, like you say, are kind of planted along our way, teachers or influences or that sort of thing. And we take those things on, and they are ideas within our head. But I guess I think part of the distinction they were trying to make is that when we think about, the elements of our worldview and try to trace back the origination of them, a lot of times we can think back to, books we read or influences in our life. And so there's kind of this chain of custody of that idea. Whereas what it seemed, at least sometimes when they spoke about it or tried to describe it in the film, was that they were trying to plant this idea to which you really can't trace the origination of. And that seemed to make the difference for them, that if you could trace back where the idea came from, that would give you more of a reason to, whatever the word, to discredit it, or to somehow, treat it less than if you really believed it was original to you and you couldn't trace where it came from. So I think, there definitely is the case where ideas can be, a vast majority of them are kind of, coming from outside sources in. And even though we may be coming to these conclusions, we can kind of trace where they came from. So in a sense, that is maybe the difference they're trying to make there. But even when you look at what is happening in the dream to Cillian Murphy's character, Fisher there, in fact, that's kind of what they are doing, right? In the first level, Eames is impersonating his uncle, Fisher's uncle, right? And in this case, he is feeding him, these ideas, talking about his father's death, or talking about, what his intentions are, what his will is for him in the future. And then the next level down, Dom is talking to him about it, playing off of that idea and trying to plant others. And so there is very much a level where you're getting those influences. Those ideas are being planted in his head, but because it's put in this dream sense, if you can couch it in the fact that he's in the dream and the people are giving it to him in the dream, normally in a closed system of a dream, those inputs would all be coming subconsciously. So if you could still get that far down, have that sort of environment, and come away with the idea that I don't remember anyone in real life telling me this, and yet I came to that conclusion, maybe that would make the difference for them. But you're definitely correct. When you're thinking about the personification of, or the classification of an idea like a virus, I think to kind of a story in my history of kind of No King But Christ, in my study of apologetics. When a couple of years after I graduated from college and was in the working world, I was confronted with a few coworkers who would have, philosophical or religious conversations at work, and they were very militant atheists. They were very committed. And they raised questions to me that I couldn't answer. And by asking those questions to me and making me think through them, confront my own, thoughts about that, I realized that I didn't have good answers for them. And that idea in my mind that maybe what I had believed was not so obvious to people, but had possible defeaters, really took hold. And for many months, I struggled with that. So in a very real sense, yeah, that idea got into my head. I knew where it came from, but it didn't matter. It still kind of grew in my mind to this thing that I couldn't ignore, this idea that would just haunt me for a long time, like a virus, like a cancer. So, I mean, it's absolutely correct. And even in the case of not Inception, or that you could trace back that idea, doesn't make it any different, really. That idea, no matter where it came from itself, it's very much has a life of its own. So that was definitely a big theme that I think just probably made the average person think a little bit more about the ideas they have in their head from a day-to-day perspective, right?
Sure. Well, and in the film, the idea that the reason that Cobb knows that Inception's possible is because he would go into this dream state with his wife, and they created this whole big world there, and then she didn't want to leave. She began to think that it was the real world. And so he planted an idea in her mind, which was that this isn't the real world, and that in the way, of course, in the dream that you wake up is one of the ways to wake up is death. So you kill yourself in the dream and you go out of the dream world. So he implants this idea in her head: this isn't the real world. You should kill yourself and and get back to the real world. And then that grows so that when she does go back to the real world, that still is in her head. But it is interesting to think about the way, you can sort of drop a seed and it can grow into something else. And I mean, I started thinking about different examples where maybe you can see that, like, So, for example, this Judeo-Christian idea of the image of God in all people, you can sort of trace where that goes in Western civilization, and you can look at the fact that Western civilization, for all its flaws and all of its black spots and things like that, it was unique in a lot of ways from other cultures, in that it was, I believe, the first civilization to abolish slavery. You have feminism and human rights growing and flourishing more in the West than you have in other places. And it seems to me that you can trace this back to this idea of the image of God in all people, and thus the value of all people. And then you sort of see how that grows. And then I think of other things too, like resentment toward the rich, and how that becomes Marxism, and then that grows into all these other things, or the inherent badness of material things. You sort of see like in Gnosticism, or even just, the very idea of monotheism, because with monotheism you have transcendence, you have ultimate authority, you have objective morality, objective truth. And so it becomes a very different way of looking at the world. Once you start with this idea, there's this cumulative effect as it rolls down the hill. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but this whole idea of a small idea growing is an interesting one that's in the film.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the tendency for that idea to have other ramifications, right? I mean, when I was confronting the idea that maybe my ideas of creation or morality or something were not quite rooted the way that I had grown up thinking they were, and even though I couldn't defend it, that naturally leads to other logical implications, right? And that's definitely the case with politics as well. When you're starting with some fundamental principles, those principles naturally start to lead out into other areas. And so if you get an idea that runs counter to those things, then naturally it's going to have other consequential principles that flow from it and lead you to those kind of downstream effects, like you mentioned, like communism, or you think of Darwinism in the 19th century, and that leading into social Darwinism and all its sort of implications that come from that through what you saw in the progressive era and the early first half of the 20th century, programs like eugenics and even into some of the racism that persisted after the Reconstruction and everything. So it definitely plays just as much of a role there in politics as well as philosophy. Yeah.
Sure. Well, yeah, and evolution is one of the interesting things, because it does get picked up by other disciplines that have nothing to do with science or biology at all. And so if you start looking at comparative religion or biblical studies, you'll start seeing things like, okay, well, we start with multiple gods, and then we start kind of paring them down, and so there's this whole idea that we're moving on a certain trajectory.
Yeah, there's a tree of religion, almost like a tree of life, right? So if you started with many, you went down to one, and ultimately we're evolving toward none. Sure. Right? Is the implications they bear out? Yeah.
Or even in the way like biblical studies, like the Old Testament, is cut up into different parts based on where they think, how they think Israelite religion evolved. So we'll stick this verse goes here, this verse goes there. So we'll kind of cut these books into all these different pieces, because we have sort of been influenced by this idea of evolution, and we're just going to apply it to everything. Yeah. And kind of what you said too, the first thing you were talking about with thinking through things you may have been wrong about or whatever, I think the idea of doubt is kind of like that. So sometimes if you find that something that you have been led to believe is wrong, that inserts this idea of doubt. And so then you start to doubt everything. And so you see, you hear a lot about deconstruction in faith. So you'll have people who will sort of go, well, I was wrong. My church was wrong about this or whatever. So I'm just kind of taking things off bit by bit. And then sometimes you find that they've got nothing left by the time they're done with it.
We've had a spout of that recently, haven't we?
Yeah.
With Josh Harris and then a number of kind of high profile people. Yeah.
Sure.
And throwing out the good with the bath, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right?
Sure.
Definitely. See, I understand kind of the normal, kind of the face value interpretation of a lot of the themes in the film, but definitely when I was looking, rewatching the film now, I made a point to look at it from Mal's perspective, if I could, with that doubt that she had even from the beginning, right? So she, it's a really kind of horrific scene in the about 2/3 of the way through the film, right, where Cobb is really explaining to Ariadne what happened in limbo, what happened with his wife. And they're in this area. They understand they have to get out. The only way they're going to be able to get out, when they need to, is to die. So they force themselves to lay on that train track, both of them, and wait. And then, of course, this kind of iconic, mantra they have for themselves almost. You're waiting for a train. You know where it's supposed to take you, but you can't know for sure, right? And so, you've got that scene, and I started to really think through the sort of imagery we have there, right? Where this long black train shows up later in the dream world, right? This imagery, this kind of common cultural trope of a long train being symbolic of death, so it kind of rears its head in these different cases, and then ultimately Mal becomes convinced in what Dom thinks, at least, is the real world. So you're at the top level, right? You're at the real world level, and there's nowhere else to go. But Mal is convinced there's another level up. I watched that film thinking, what if Mal was right? Because Dom can't know for sure. And this is this whole mantra, right? You're waiting for this train. You don't actually know for sure. So I'm thinking through every time Mal comes in, sure, we're kind of led to believe, or at least Dom is explaining it, that Mal is continuously coming into the dream worlds that Dom is in, and trying to instill this doubt into Dom as well to get him to stay there with her, or to go, even one more level out like she did earlier. I started thinking, what if Mal was right? What if Mal is coming into Dom's dream like he would do to other people, and trying to get him to come, out one more level? And if we think, I started to apply the sort of dream sense, this dream world and the real world sense, to our physical life and our later spiritual, afterlife, in a sense, right? So obviously, if you're a Christian, if you're a theist, you believe that this life, it's not a dream in the sense that our experiences, the things we go through, the works we do, have an impact, but ultimately, compared to presence and that closeness and intimacy with Christ that we would have in the afterlife, it is almost almost on the level of a dream. It's not. It's only a shadow of the things to come, right? We see through that glass darkly. It's clouded, it's obscured, and so I think about if you or I knew, okay, we needed to die, to experience the real world, because this wasn't the real world. Would we be able to lay down? Would we be able to be a martyr? Like the first century Christians were. Would we be able to lay down on that train, even though we knew that we would be waking up, in the presence of Christ? That's hard to think through. I mean, so I kept thinking of, bringing up that imagery of this parallel to our life and what we believe is this higher level, kind of represented in that dream world by the different levels of the dream, right? If we wake up, there's a little bit of parallel there, to the afterlife, physical reality that we understand here, and the dream world that we have there. I started thinking of through, maybe if Mal was right, tried to find another level to the story. Hopefully that made sense.
Sure it did. Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think, right? Because somebody who thinks that this life is it is sort of like the person who goes into the dream world and thinks that the dream world is it, right? It's only a shadow of reality. It's not the full substance of the being.
Yeah, I mean, she says that sort of thing the whole time, right? And of course, once you've seen it once, and then you come into it with a little bit of more of that perspective, I mean, you see different things, like people showing up right when they need to save Dom from trouble or something, right? In Limbo, when he meets Mal later on, he says, you need to snap out of this. I have to get back to the real world so we can be with our kids. And she says, no, my kids are here. He says, our kids are up above. And so I'm thinking, the way we kind of think of that level of, Christ or the spiritual realm being above. And she scoffs at him, almost like this evil influence. And yet, what if she's right? What if she knows where his kids actually are and he doesn't really know? But she draws attention to those sorts of things, being chased around by the shadowy organization, and for some reason you can't go back, trying to put that doubt into Dom. And it's kind of up to the viewer to decide whether or not she's right and he needs to doubt that, or she's kind of plagued by this doubt that she can't quite let go. But ultimately, we believe Dom. It's kind of who do you believe, more at the end of the film. And of course, it's left with a little bit of cliffhanger at the end. It's kind of hard to tell whether who was right or not. But.
Yeah, and I thought about that too, whether it was possible that she was really there and coming in as opposed to a projection of his own mind. And I think the only reason why I feel like she isn't is because she's not asking him to go further up, but to go further down. And so that suggests more to me that it's a, kind of a projection of his psyche trying to bring him back into this world where he can have her, knowing that he's going into a dream world, as opposed to, well, I mean, so I don't know, unless you have to think that there's some kind of a reversal and that the real world is somehow the world that you go into as opposed to come out into, or go down into instead of come up out of,
Yeah, I mean, there's, in what we're shown, anyways, is a memory of his, real world experience. She tries to get him to go one level up with her initially, and then later on, you're right. She says just to stay down there with her. So yeah, it's hard to. I mean, she does have the name of Mal, which from a Latin perspective is almost kind of telling you that she's bad, right? It's this bad Latin root, so you shouldn't trust her, And there's definitely elements of there that would lead you to that. But I mean, if anything, it probably speaks to something of the depth or the complexity of the writing in the film involved, really, right? The fact that you could see both and you can see validity in both, and you can take something learn something from both views, even if there is one, right interpretation of the entire, the entire storyline, right?
Yeah, and it seems like maybe the Mal who is trying to get him to commit suicide in the quote-unquote real world, I mean, she could be correct, but it seems that the Mal who's trying to bring him further in later would almost have to be a projection, I would think.
Yeah, I don't know. You could maybe argue if in the hotel he was still in a dream world that her at that point was a projection, and the one that's showing up later is actually her. I don't know. Yeah. Like I said, I'm sure there are Reddit threads full of this exact conversation, right? Bringing up all the points. But regardless, I definitely was seeing, with the train symbolism and just the idea that they could be in that world for decades, right, and grow old together, and then wake up and have it been a couple hours, in their real sense. It really makes you think about, the idea of God being outside of space and time, in which, for him in that timelessness, our entire lifetime or the entire track of human history is blown out in this sense. But for him, or for those maybe in his presence, seeing this or experiencing this, it seems like an eternity, but in fact it was just a moment, So I definitely just saw a lot of, part of why I thought it would be good to talk about it, in this sort of setting, because I think it definitely has it. If nothing else, it made me think about spiritual things, when I was watching it. Definitely, if you approach it like that, I think there's some depth there that can be gotten, right?
What's interesting too to think about, as you were talking about how the dream can be years long, or the dream within a dream within a dream can be years long, is the interior of our psyche or our subconscious is, I mean, so much more capable than my actual conscious experiences. Like, if you told me, I would like you to sit down and create some kind of, draw out a landscape or what the interior of a building looks like, I would be hard pressed. I have to think really, just, to craft something. But you put me in that dream world, and my mind goes overtime to create all of these scenes and all of these people and all of these scenarios that I couldn't imagine creating in my waking experience. And there is something, they sort of talk about that in the film, how your mind will just create those things. And I hadn't thought a lot about that, but it does suggest that, there's something more powerful about the human mind than we're aware of. Human creativity is something to I don't know, be amazed at. Mm-hmm. There is a kind of a brief scene where they sort of walk in on these people who basically live for the dream world. They kind of do their day thing, and then they go in this basement and hook themselves up to each other, and then go into this dream world that they see as their reality. It's become their reality. And Cobb is, I think, sort of chastised, by saying, well, who are you to say otherwise, And that brings up this question about whether reality, or how much of reality is subjective and how much of reality is objective. And you see that with Mal, of course. She's convinced that the dream world that she creates is the real world, that the real world is just a dream. And then, to kind of bring it back to Rene Descartes, his whole thought experiment, as he was trying to discern what we could actually know about, reality altogether, was he came with this thought experiment of the evil demon, who he had the utmost power and cunning, and used it to employ all his energies in order to deceive me. So this evil demon is giving Rene Descartes his entire perception of the world, and so that everything that Descartes is seeing perhaps is an illusion that's being brought on by this other being, And Descartes' sort of struggle was, okay, well, it sounds sort of silly, but could I prove that that's not true? And the only thing he can really come up with at the end is, well, I know that I exist because I'm thinking, but beyond that, what can I know? So on this question of the subjectivity of reality, I had this thought. So if Cobb had stayed with his projection of Mal in the dream world, even though, of course, he knows on some level that it's not really her, would he have been able to tell the difference? People can surprise us, but on some level, our knowledge of everyone that we know is it kind of creates this projection, right? So we have these experiences with them, and based on that, we think we know them. We can sort of conjure them up in our head. We can imagine how they might react to certain things, what they might say, how they might move. And so then I had this thought, if my wife was replaced right now with a construct based on my memories of her, how long would it take before I would notice? And that sort of goes into this idea of how much of reality is just what we experience and how much of reality is what we project onto it.
Well, there's a lot of depth there to mine, right? I mean, yeah, definitely. You when you go through the scene, in the whatever you would call him, a toxicologist or the chemist, right? The chemist's laboratory downstairs with all the kind of slaves there. I mean, there's definitely some cultural lessons to learn out of this film, right? In the sense that this sort of raw creativity. I mean, you see it first when Ariadne, goes into the dream world. She begins to create, and then she says, I'm done with this. And then the next day she can't help herself but come back because she's already addicted. She's already tasted what that kind of raw creative power is like, and she can't live without it. And so she comes back. Obviously, the people in that basement of the chemist feel much the same way, whether or not they're creating there or they've just been there long enough that they desire to be there more than the real world. There's some cultural lines to draw there, probably even deeper than could have been seen in 2010, right? Because I mean, I think back in the day, if you think of Second Life or, The Sims or some sort of that sort of analog, there is that in the real world. But obviously we're moving toward, AR and VR of the realm of, Ready Player One, if you're in a more modern, references, or Snow Crash or that sort of thing. When we're getting to the point where people would desire more to be part of, social media groups than they would desire to be part of an actual community group with real people. Obviously, I don't hold to relativism in that sense where, we can honestly say, well, it's their reality versus your reality, and none of them is really objective in any sense. But you're right. I mean, when we think about what sort of, where do we draw the line between someone's experience and actual reality, right? Because much like the historicists or, people in, that string of philosophy would say, we can't really understand reality without our experience, and we can't see it outside of that, at least not as clearly as we would like. We're limited in our ability to comprehend those things based on our experience. I think the big thing that the film also adds in, though, and that we can also kind of draw real world correlations to, is, if you think of the totems that they have in the film, right? They're always told to have something that they take with them that they know better than anyone else, little tchotchkes or things they can put in their pocket that kind of represent to them a semblance of the objective. And then everywhere they go, they're able to test things based on that objective. So when it comes to trying to kind of differentiate that subjective reality, that experiential reality, and actual reality, they have these totems. I mean, when I was watching the film, I said, what is our totem in this kind of life that we have, but Scripture? And so if you hold, epistemologically, that Scripture represents this kind of view of objective truth that we can always compare our experience to, that is almost like our totem that we carry through that world. Now, I will notice that Dom's totem is not his totem. It is Mao's old totem, right? That little pawn that he has. So I was always thinking that maybe in the film that was another key to understanding whether Dom was in the real world or not, was because he didn't actually know it as well. Mao could have, played with that, been playing with him. But and of course that sort of thing comes up in our world too. How reliable is Scripture? How inerrant is it? That sort of thing. So I saw a lot of those cultural, correlations there. If you think about, antisocial tendencies or trends in, in culture today, of just being able to kind of curate your own reality, really, in a sense, your own ecosystem, your own environment that you're in, not really having to deal with any other reality of your own, Those people in the film obviously began to choose that, and I think you definitely see some people doing that now as well. It's definitely a challenge if you're trying to teach objectivism or trying to do apologetics or that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, I like what you said about the totem. And it sort of seems to me like it's almost like a tether, right? So sometimes we will find ourselves falling into some kind of subjectivity or relativism, and that we need something to hold on to that tethers us back to reality. So we have this conception of, this is the thing I want to hold on to. This is what's real. And so I need to be connected to that. And so, it seems to me, like you said, it could be Scripture, something that we know about, maybe God's character, for example. And I think about things like anxiety or mental illness, where sometimes reality can be twisted because of this perspective, because of this trick that our mind plays on us, and that we're going to experience that and it's going to happen, but that it's helpful to have something to be tethered to, that we know, okay, what I'm feeling right now is not reality. This thing here is reality. This thing that I'm tethered to, and I should not cut that tether, because when I cut that tether, I've left reality and I've moved into subjectivism.
You're absolutely right. In the it was at Descartes, in that example, we're absolutely as human beings with a human nature, we are and being physical beings, limited by our nature and by our faculties, right? So absolutely, our perception of reality is completely limited in many ways based on what some people would call faith. We have faith that the history past, our memories of history were actually memories and not just planted on us a second ago, fully formed, right? That's definitely a philosophy exercise and epistemology and reality that you'll see sometimes. How do we know that we weren't just all dreamt up a minute ago with all of our dream memories intact, but in actuality, none of that past actually occurred?
Or also the existence of other minds, right? Because one of the ways that we get past subjectivism is to check our experience with others. And that only works if other people actually exist.
Yeah, I think that's a solipsistic, if I'm using the right terminology there. But yeah, we have to trust that those around us are not figments of our own imagination.
Yeah. Which we can't actually prove.
We can't prove, no. And, so obviously we look to things that correspond to that belief, right? So that we can kind of assume. We look for defeaters, to that view and try to defeat those defeaters if we can, philosophically. But, this applies not just to philosophy, not just to religion even, but, to science itself. There are ways in which, we trust that when we see something that's white, it's actually white, and it's not just our eyes working incorrectly across the entire, human spectrum or something. I mean, there's plenty of ways in which we take these things, on faith that they are operating correctly. And it's not to say they're unwarranted or unfounded. I mean, they're obviously everything we can tell in many of those cases undergirds that belief, and they're definitely fundamentally basic. But that doesn't mean that they are equally as demonstrable or objective or testable as other observations we might have kind of down the line, right?
Well, and I think for me, the question becomes, if we can't prove or can't know whether or not we've been deceived by an evil demon or that we're in a dream or part of a computer simulation, should we proceed as if everyone that exists is a construct of our mind or is there to deceive us? Or even though we can't know it for sure, should we proceed as if our faculties are trustworthy and that reality is not illusory? Because ultimately you can't prove it one way or another. So upon what basis should we proceed? What is the idea that we should put our faith in?
Oh yeah, well, it's not a thought experiment I've run in recent past, so so it's difficult to defend at a moment's notice. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you were struggling with this and you're a listener, I would probably say you run with one and see how well that works, right? I mean, there's something to be said, and I think people like Lewis have brought this up in the past, right? That if we have to assume something about reality that we can't actually live up to in our everyday life, then it's probably reasonable to assume that assumption that we're having is an incorrect assumption. So, for instance, if we say, well, I believe that morality is completely subjective in the world, so I'm going to live now as though, nothing is actually right or wrong, and I'm going to proceed like that. But then the first second someone cuts you in line or, punches you in the face, you're going to inevitably respond in a sense that was actually wrong for them to do that, because we can't physically live out the conviction or the belief that, morality is completely a subjective construct that has no objective grounding in reality. And so when we see ourselves butting up against, these sorts of philosophical assumptions we might have, and being unable to live consistently with that, just as human beings, it's a fair assumption, just at that level, that we probably have something messed up in our worldview that might not be a warranted or a justified assumption that we have.
The thing that stuck out in the film to me, one more thing, is this notion of the reification or personification of guilt. That and really, I mean, guilt or regret can become a part of our subconscious. You know, these memories of regret that we feel, they feel as real as when they happen. So, like, Mal, Cobb's dead wife, she feels more like a real character in the film and less like a projection, even though supposedly she is. And I mean, it makes me think about things that I've done that I've regretted, whether it was immoral or just embarrassing or whatever. But then I create this projection of the person that I've embarrassed myself in front of, or wronged or something, and they're always there in my head to disapprove, to mock me, or to just be eternally hurt and unable to move past it. And they become like this, like Jacob Marley's ghost, where they're just sort of chained to this thing that I've done, and that's probably not at all the case. But it's something that my brain does. And, really, I guess when we do that, we're the ones who become like Jacob Marley's ghost. We become unable to live and move and act, as free agents because we're chained to this thing that we've done. But I like the way the film expresses that. I don't know if you have any thoughts to add to that, but it was just something that really stuck out for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely a theme throughout, literary history, right? If it's Poe's Telltale Heart, that just always hounds him, these constant reminders, it's definitely well done, in the film. And it doesn't really come out until later on, obviously, in the film, that it's actually kind of there because of guilt. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a point. Now, I don't know how I don't struggle with that as much as different personality types, right? I mean, there are those I think that struggle with that more, and those that struggle with it less. I mean, obviously, if I had a hand in my wife's demise, I'm sure I would probably feel quite guilty of that. But I mean, it's probably enough to make you thankful for grace and and forgiveness through Christ, right? I mean, it's tough to imagine having to carry that sort of burden without knowing, that you had forgiveness from anyone at any level. So, yeah, I mean, it's a big theme in there as well.
Sure. So, do you have anything to add before we start wrapping up? Other things that you noticed in the film that we didn't really discuss, or?
Well, I think we hit on a lot. I mean, this film is coming up on almost 20 years old now, right? If it's released in 2010 and or 10 years old.
10 years. Mm-hmm.
That's I know my life has changed quite a bit in 10 years. When I would have seen this around that time, I forget if I saw it in the theater or just shortly after. I hadn't been married yet, hadn't had children yet, and as I watched the film again, especially with that kind of critical eye, just really trying to understand what was being said and really feel, what the story was having to say. It's been said in other arenas, but I'll reemphasize it here. There is just a level in probably every art form, right? But especially in film and the visual medium and storytelling, that there is just a level of storytelling and empathy that you really cannot grasp outside of being a parent or outside of being married. When you see Dom go through watching his wife, step off a ledge and having to live with that, or having the knowledge that your children are in the next country over, but you can't see them. I don't remember being hit that hard in the chest with those things then as I absolutely am now. So I was just really I mean, it's a hard film to watch, I think, if you're a parent or if you're, if you're a husband or a wife. It's really, it's a reason why it's a very impactful film, but it's definitely not one that I tend to, watch on repeat a whole lot. It's not quite as much of an enjoyable film even now as it was before. Still has just as much to teach, but just hits so much harder from an empathy, an empathic level. So that was definitely something that stuck out to me. But no, I mean, it was definitely interesting to get back into into this and start thinking through it again, and gave me a new appreciation and got my mind sparked a little bit. So yeah, it was a fun Well, I guess fun ride is it's an okay way to do it. Certainly an interesting one, yeah.
Sure, yeah. I find these conversations are beneficial because knowing that I'm going to have to come here and talk about something for an hour, I look at movies a little bit more closely than I might normally. And so you start to really think about the connections here. And, I only mentioned one philosopher, but I was going to say it's a philosophy podcast, so I'm going to have to mention some philosophers here. Probably.
I could have mentioned more, but I didn't want to get
Sure,
super technical about
Yeah,
it.
I know. Yeah, I could have mentioned.
Yeah, listen, we've got
so
many. We have so many names we could have dropped, and we were just being easy on everyone. All right.
Yeah, make it easy for people to follow. But it was really great to have you here. And before I go, though, I do want you to kind of remind people about what No King But Christ is and where they can find out more about it.
Sure. So the main blog is at nokingbutchrist.org. We're on Facebook, Twitter. If you search for them, we have I think is a kind of a neat Instagram account as well under No King But Christ. We've got nice little shareable memes on different, not the meme culture type memes. I don't go in for a lot of those, but quote memes and things that I think are really it's in the respectable. You won't feel bad about sharing them. I'll say, even if they are provocative. And then of course the YouTube channel at No King But Christ as well should be pretty easy to find. A lot of the articles that we've done in the past in video form. So if you like, consuming that, being able to see some imagery and that sort of thing, along with your lesson, you got that as well. Really, nice to share with people as well. But everything No King But Christ, it should be pretty easy to find. And
so the website is nokingbutchrist.org. The YouTube channel is youtube.com/nokingbutchrist. And then the Instagram is No King But Christ blog. And yes, the memes are very respectable. I also have memes. They're not as respectable, not nearly as respectable. But yeah, and it's very shareable content. So yeah, man, Adam, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate you taking time to do this with me, to watch the film, to take some time to think through and take some notes and just to be here.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
Thank you, Adam.